So I'm your eyeline, obviously. How did you end up in Florence, Frank?
Ah, benvenuto a casa, prima cosa, è una bella cosa di avere tutti di voi a casa mia, è proprio una bella cosa. Sono molto contento di fare questa intervista, è una
No,
cosa bellissima. Beh, scusami,
we need this to be in English. I'm sorry.
cosa ha detto?
Eh,
Ha detto cosa? English.
English.
Devo parlare English? Oh boy. Uh, Okay, but I must tell you my English is not so good no more because I come to this country in come si dice in inglese? 2005. 2005. I come to this country e se tu vuoi proprio live in Italy, tu have to speak in Italian. Because if you get in trouble on the street with the car and you don't stop at the stop sign and the police come, they give you tickets if you speak English. Quindi I need always speak Italian, but I try because I want to make everyone happy.
So what was the first horror film you ever saw that made a big impact on you growing up?
The first horror film I ever saw. All right, yeah, that's a question that you advanced me a bit, to give me a heads up. And I had to really think about that. And I'll tell you the truth. I can't remember what the first one I saw was in its entirety, but I can remember what the first one I saw was in short. And by that I mean, when I was a kid, I used to collect the Castle 8 millimeter home movies. They weren't home movies, they were compilations of the Universal classics. I loved them. So I had Bride of Frankenstein, I had Dracula, I had Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And I think that's really what began my love for the genre. And so the first time I saw any of the Universal classics, even in part, was when my dad taught me how to thread up our 8 millimeter home movie projector at about 7 years old. And I watched those films, and it was exciting to have enough money, save up enough money from whatever, from birthday gifts or a pittance of an allowance that I occasionally got, to make a trek to the local department store, and it was thrilling to find these films. Now, my cousin Charlie, who executive produced both Fear No Evil and Lady in White, he was 3 years older than me. And he was a fan as well of the Universal horror films. And he would collect these films as well. We'd get together on the weekends. Whenever one of those films eventually showed up, like Bride of Frankenstein or Dracula on television, because back then we just had to wait with bated breath and hope that they would show up so we could see them in their entirety. But we had another goal, and that was to record the sound, because these 8 millimeter films were silent. And we thought, well, if we could record the sound on our reel-to-reel, tape recorders, we could edit the quarter-inch tape and have sound for these films, edit to the Castle condensed version horror releases, Universal Horror Classics. So we did this. The problem was we had two tape recorders. We were just kids. We tried to match up the sound and edit with the two tape recorders to the Castle versions. And they would never be in sync. They would start out in sync and then they would fall out of sync. And we'd bang our heads against the wall trying to, well, what is this? Well, later on, they could never have been in sync. And the reason they could never have been in sync is because these films were being projected, the Castle films, at 18 frames per second, whereas 16 millimeter 35, the going rate is 24 frames per second. So there was no way we could ever get those films to sync. But it would drive us crazy because we'd be watching Dracula, we'd get the coffin lid to close, and then boom, it'd sync, and then all the rest of it would be out of sync. But a few years later, many years later, actually, we finally realized that it was an impossible chore. There was no way we were going to get those films to sync 24 frames versus 18 frames.
But you were interested in the technical aspects from when you were a kid, huh?
Yeah, I tried to make my first film at 11. I never completed it. And it was about the last night in Marilyn Monroe's life. It really was. And because I was so compelled and so hurt when I found out, that she had died so tragically, And so I remember an aunt of mine was visiting from Florida, my mother's only sister. And I scripted the thing out and I said, we're going to portray the last one. And I researched all of this as to what exactly happened to her. But I didn't want to use any faces or anything. I just wanted to use tight shots. So I filmed an 8mm, my aunt's slippers, and she was supposed to have been the maid, the housekeeper that discovered Marilyn dead. And her point of view, seeing a light coming from beneath the door in Marilyn's bedroom, and then the telephone, just hanging off the edge of the mattress, that sort of thing, with Marilyn's hand, and that's the way I did it. It lasted for about 2 or 3 minutes. And then I realized it was a piece of crap, and I decided I wasn't going to finish it. So that was the first. The second didn't arrive until I was 16 years old, 15 or 16. And that was when my English teacher had demanded that we all write another damned English paper. And I was a huge fan of film at that point. And I said, well, I don't want to write another English paper. How about if I make a movie? And she said, okay. She called me and she said, there's the second cap. Go ahead and make a movie. I said, oh, Christ, now I got to make a movie. So I came up with this concept. It was called The Clown and the Light. I got my buddy Scott to help me. He was going to be the DP. I wanted to shoot it in black and white because it had this arty kind of feel about it. And it was very simple. It was about a clown that finds a spot of light in a black limbo, and he tries to move in and make the light his home. It's fine. The light's fine with him initially as they meet, circle of light. But when he tries to move in and make the light his home, it moves and cuts him out. It doesn't. And when he tries to nail it down to keep his little plant and his footstool in his chair and be comfortable, the light destroys him. That was The Clown and the Light. So it was 10 minutes long. And it was great because I did finish that one. I shot it on a film stock called Perutz film. I wanted it in black and white. It was this French film stock that I found. I had to send it to Arizona from Rochester, New York, where I grew up, to get it processed. I had to wait for 2 months because they weren't processing this bizarre black and white film. They didn't have any soup for it. And they finally sent it back to me, cut it together. And it was great because I got out of going to classes all day long. They stuck me in the auditorium of the school. Everybody was amazed with the film. I had an original piano score that I composed and played. And I didn't have to go to classes all day. And so that was the beginning of the saga. Following that, there were 2 short films in 16mm. And the last one was the epic. That was a $10,000 30-minute short. And the shorts went on. They won awards at short film festivals, that sort of thing. And by then I was doomed.
Wow, I mean, it's interesting because I know that you did some acting as well, but you've always been a director at heart, I assume.
I've always loved the art of film, even as a kid. I have a story. You know, when they ask kids, when you're really, really young, what you want to be when you grow up, you know what my first answer was always to that question, what I thought I really wanted to be? A scientist. And everybody said, wow, he's only like 6 years old, 7. He wants to be a scientist, 5, 6 years old. Why? Wow, yeah, you really want to be a scientist, Frank? Yeah, I want to be a scientist. And then I realized that the reason I wanted to be a scientist is because I wanted to make monsters. I mean, scientists made monsters, right? Dr. Frankenstein made his monster, and scientists had the capacity to create these incredible beings, They could make benevolent monsters, or they could make horrific, frightening, evil monsters. And as I grew even older, I realized the way to make monsters is to make movies. That's what I really wanted to do. So those old Castle 8mm movies and those condensed films, it was really about wanting to be a director all along. And when you think about it, directors are like mad scientists. I mean, nothing will stop them. They're compelled, beyond any sort of human capacity for endurance to create their monster, the film, to finish their monster at all costs. And sometimes it's a benevolent monster. It will bring you tremendous joy and satisfaction. And other times, it's a hell of a creature. It's a hideous monster that will do all it can to destroy you. And so that's what movies are. They're monsters. Directors are scientists making their monsters, or scientists are directors, or however you want to think about it. But
So
yep.
you're obviously a monster kid at heart, but what would you say sets 80s horror apart from other decades? What makes 80s horror special?
How about stupid? No, I know I'm not supposed to say that. I'm going to tell you seriously. And I'm probably going to get cut out of the documentary for this, but I'm not a big fan of 80s horror. As a matter of fact, what I had to do was I decided that I would do a Google search to try to recollect and take a look at the films that were released during that era. But I did find three, that I cared about, even back then, and I still do. But they're a bit contrary and out of the realm of what most 80s horror fans are nuts about. Altered States is one of them. If you could call that a horror film. But in my search, it was listed as a horror. Just like Lady in White is referred to as a horror film, I don't consider it a horror film, especially not an 80s horror film, even though it was released in the 80s. But tremendous director, Ken Russell, who is always one of my favorites, who created Women in Love and The Music Lovers. I used to go see those films at revival houses when that was the only way to see them repeatedly every time they showed up. Another was Something Wicked, This Way Comes, which I decided to watch again just the other night. And even after, another great director, one of my favorites of all time, Jack Clayton, who directed perhaps my favorite ghost story of all time, Lady Notwithstanding, and that is The Innocents.
My favorite too. I love that one.
Yeah, and he directed Something Wicked, This Way Comes. Disney gave him a terrible time in post, and the picture suffered based on what I've read. And you can see that there are problems with it, structurally, but it's still a wonderful film. And the third one was Neil Jordan's Company of Wolves. Remember that? So those three, as a matter of fact, I remember that when Russ Carpenter, the DP on Lady in White, and I were planning the visuals, we viewed a number of films, that together, obviously, for visual insights. And Company of Wolves was one of the films that we studied as to lighting, as to set design, and I wanted that kind of fairy tale-ish look, to Lady.
So, what about the 80s, what makes 80s filmmaking unique? Why were those films, and your films, for example, what's the sort of aura or flair about them that endears them to people even today, do you think?
I think it was the practical effects more than anything else. Optical effects, less so. But the practical effects, this is the sort of thing that Rob Bottin was doing. And I think that's really more than anything else. I think it's fairly obvious what sets them apart, at least the ones that had budgets, and at least a certain enough money to hire the best guys to do that sort of thing. From a storytelling perspective, I mean, it's like they're all basically the same. It's hard for me. I'm going to tell you the truth. I've never seen any of the I hadn't seen any of the Nightmare on Elm Street films until about a year ago, and I tried to watch. Maybe a little bit more than that. Again, I'm going to get all of this is going to wind up with a cutting report. There's no way. I'm sorry you're spending money on this interview because I know I'm not going to wind up in this show. But in any case, I couldn't sit through Nightmare, the first one. I could not deal with it. It's not because I'm hoity-toity because I'm not. It's not because I feel I'm better than that. I'm not. It's just that kind of storytelling, those kinds of characters, and seeing them repeatedly over and over and over again, the same circumstance. They bore me. It's even Fear No Evil, which turned out to be more than a bit of a truncated mess because of what happened, in post-production with the editing. I hadn't watched Fear No Evil for years until Scream Factory came out with the Blu-ray. So I wanted to see what it looked like. It had been lots and lots of years since I'd watched it. And I watched it and I thought, oh boy, it was hard. It was painful because I remember what the film was when we were at the work print phase in New York when I was cutting it, before we made the deal with Afghan Embassy. And what it became was an entirely different picture. But to stay on point, I watched it and I thought, this works, that doesn't work, oh boy, that's cringeworthy, oh boy. But there's so much stuff in that film that is way out there and impressively unique. Now, for the most part, 80s films are cookie cutter, But what I was trying to do with Fear No Evil was kind of make something unique, and nonetheless, because money was telling me, even though we financed the film independently, because Charlie he wanted me to make another Night of the Living Dead, and that's just not where I was coming from. So it became this hybrid thing, I wanted to make it personal. It had to be personal because that's the only way I could make movies. And yet I wanted to appease Charlie and be sure to make something that we might have a shot at getting distributed later, because there was no distributor attached. We raised the money independently to make Fear No Evil, just like we did with Lady. And all of that clashed, ultimately, and resulted in a film that's sadly not what it might have been. And to further that point, I wanted to also state that I remember when I was in New York cutting the picture, and we were still at work print, AFCO wasn't involved, AFCO Embassy Pictures, the company that released the film at that point. I remember that I managed to get a guy by the name of Mark Damon to come see the picture in work print. I set up a screening for him at Movie Lab. Now, Mark Damon was the head of an international sales organization, the most important of that era, called Producers Sales Organization. And he and his wife agreed to come and take a look at the film. We ran the work print, no effects, nothing. And he turned to me and he said, wow, he said, can you get this thing done for Cannes this year? I think I can get this into the director's fortnight. And I said, we don't even have the money to finish post-production. We're trying, can you get me the money? But how long would I have to do this? He said, well, I'm going to get the guy from Cannes, his name I can't remember now, who was in New York at the time. He got him to come and see, and he said, I'd like to have this film in the director's fortnight. Can you finish it in 2 months? And I said, no. I said, I don't even have the money to begin the effects work. But I bring this up because Fear No Evil, director's fortnight, that's how different the movie was at that stage. When it got to Afghan Embassy, and the thing that made it most frustrating, most hurtful, was that ultimately they had control, total control over the final cut, but they made me make the edits with an editor that was assigned to the picture. And it was horrendous because little by little I saw it restructured, reorganized, chopped up to the extent of its becoming something, well, what it essentially became, a picture that at best works in fits and starts. But there was a time when it was something very, very different, at least as far as Mark Damon was concerned.
So I am curious about sort of your road to that film. It's obviously your directorial debut.
Can we stop so I can have a drink of water? Because let me just grab, I'm cottonmouth. Does I?
80s horror, I corrected myself. And just to make sure you're looking at me, correct, not the camera.
No, I'm looking at you.
Good.
What are you, a bit cross-eyed, Rocco? You know, what's the matter? You got it. I didn't want to mention it, but I did notice. I'm looking at you. I'm looking at you, kid. No. No, it's not. Are we rolling again?
Un secondo, non devi passare che si vede la riflesso sulla...
No, I want to clarify. I
misspoke, I'm sorry.
No, because I'm not a fan of 80s horror in general, but I'll mention some of the films that... Okay, we ready? I don't like that angle. Please try not to use that angle. I'm going to keep... I hate my profile.
Ok.
Allora, I want to clarify something. I love a great horror film. There are great horror films. There's Bride of Frankenstein. There's Frankenstein. Even Todd Browning's Dracula, which everybody tends to poo-poo these days, give me a break, is wonderful. And I watch them repeatedly. So they're the lesser universal horror classics. Even those, the music, the Hans Salter, you know, Frank Skinner's score to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is one of the most brilliant film scores ever conceived. It's a wonderful film, one of my favorites as well. But that score is incredible because every character has his own motif in that score, and they all blend together seamlessly. Watch the film again, and just watch it for the score, music. The music's always been important to me as relates to the films I've made, even the short films. I composed the music for Lady in White. I co-composed the music for Fear No Evil with David Spear. But anyway, getting back to horror films in general, I mentioned some of them. Bride of Frankenstein, you know, generally acknowledged as a real classic. That's another thing that irks me. These days, a classic seems to be defined by anything that's old. I mean, that really bugs me. But in any case, and more contemporary horror films that I adore, and one that truly frightens me is Rosemary's Baby. I mean, so, and so there. It's not that I don't like horror films. I've just never been a particular fan of 80s horror films. That's all, with the exception of the three I've mentioned, and perhaps there are others that will crop up, you know, that I'll remember.
So that's curious to me. I'm just curious how you ended up making Fear No Evil as your directorial debut.
Very simple. I had written this wonderful little kind of fantasy, heartfelt fantasy film called Arrivederci Venice that I wanted to shoot in Venice, California. And it had a wonderful life kind of feel to it, you know, this film. And that was the first feature I really wanted to make. And my cousin Charlie was the finance guy. He was the guy that I was depending on to help me figure out a way to raise money to make our first film. He wanted to make a film as well, a feature film. So we tried to see what we could do with this screenplay. I had Will Geer involved at one point, and that was way back when I first arrived in LA to play the lead when he was doing The Waltons, and it was going to be independently produced, low budget. And we tried and we tried and we tried, and we just couldn't, Charlie couldn't interest any private investors. And they kept saying, why don't you make a horror movie? Why don't you make a horror movie? So Charlie said, why don't we make a horror movie? Which he was actually, he had suggested that right from the start. Night of the Living Dead, it was that, or look at what's happened, look at what the money that thing's. So he said, there's this place in the Thousand Islands called Bolt Castle. It's this big, enormous, abandoned castle that was never finished. It's an incredible location. Have you heard about it? And he sent me some articles related to it, newspaper articles. I looked at this location. I thought, wow, this is fantastic. Now, I loved Hammer horror as well. I mean, I was a real Hammer horror kid. So I thought, whoa, this would give me a shot at something beautifully gothic as a setting, you know, and what sort of story could I build around this? And that's how Fear No Evil was born. He managed to get together we set up a limited partnership. He and I went out conjointly to pitch friends, professional people from Rochester that we knew and didn't know, doctors, lawyers, anybody got a few dollars, to invest in Fear No Evil. And so we raised ultimately $540,000 to make the picture. We shot that film for, I believe, 8 weeks, so it was a pretty good schedule, maybe even a little longer. But that 540 got us only through the shoot and through post-production up to the point of completing the work print cut. So we were stuck for all the rest of post-production. We had no money to finish the film, and Charlie insisted that I fought him. I said, you need to continue to raise money, because I was concerned that if we got a bite from a distributor, that would be it. I'd lose control of the picture. And he said, no, let's just screen it for a single distributor. And I knew who he wanted to screen it for, and that was Avco Embassy. They were the boutique, horror, low-budget horror distribution house.